Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the City Council Special Study Session, Tuesday, March 23rd, 2021. I now call the meeting to order. Councilmember Gamero, would you mind leading us in the Pledge of Allegiance?
Okay, you got it. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you so much. City Clerk, will you please do the voice roll call?
Councilmember Chavez.
Here.
Councilmember Gameros.
Here.
Councilmember Harlan.
Here.
Councilmember Harper.
Here.
Councilmember Reynolds.
Here.
Mayor Pro Tem Mar.
Here.
Thank you.
Okay, so we have one study session item for us tonight. And City Clerk, would you please read the title?
The title is the 2021-2029 Housing Element Status Update. Presentation by Ms. Lee, Development Services Director.
Thank you. So we'll hear the staff report and then we'll take public comments afterwards, just so the public's aware of what we're doing tonight. Ms. Lee, take it away.
Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem and council members. And tonight we'll be discussing the city's efforts through its general plan housing element update. This meeting is one of several study sessions and several meetings and discussions that we'll have with the council on this topic. Tonight will be a comprehensive review of the information and efforts so far on the housing element update. Tonight we'll cover some demographic data. We'll also cover the city's community outreach efforts and the feedback that we've heard from the community so far. And then really an introduction to some foundational information regarding potential strategies for the housing element that ultimately will be the basis for our next study session, where we'll get into a little more detail as to housing policies and programs. So tonight we have our housing element update team. I'd like to introduce Ms. Susan Emery, who is our interim assistant director. Also Minu Ashabi, who is the project manager and our principal planner. We also have Justin Arios, assistant planner, who's providing strong assistance on this project as well. And then finally, I'd like to introduce Nick Chen, who is our project manager from Kimley Horn, our housing element consultant. So this evening, Nick will be taking the presentation for the most part, and then we'd like to open it up for council discussion and questions. So with that, I'll turn it over to Mr. Chen.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. Good evening, Madam Mayor Pro Tem and members of City Council. It's good to be back before you. Give me a second, I will share my screen and we can get started. So you should be able to see my screen, just let me know.
Yes, we can see it.
Thumbs up, got it, perfect. As Jennifer mentioned, tonight we'll be going through a comprehensive update of the housing element update process and where we're at right now. Again, this is for the 2021 to 2029 housing element planning period. So tonight we'll be going through a summary of the housing element update process. We'll look at the community outreach so far, an evaluation of that community profile and what demographic information, a couple of highlights of that information. We'll do a brief introduction on the site's inventory analysis and some things to consider going forward. And as Jennifer mentioned, at our next study session where we'll dive a little bit more in depth into that, opportunities and considerations, and then next steps. So the housing element update process, just a couple, 2-slide, 3-slide background on it. It is unique. It's one of the required elements of the city's general plan. It is the only element that's required to be certified by the state Department of Housing and Community Development, and it is on an 8-year cycle. All jurisdictions within the SCAG region are attempting to and should locally adopt by October 15th, 2021, as that's the goal by the state for all jurisdictions in SCAG. The housing element features a couple different sections and some major components. As mentioned, the community profile is the housing and population demographic section that sets the baseline for the constraints and resources analysis, and ultimately for the programs and policies that the city is going to put into their housing element. Next, we look at constraints and resources. These are anything that could pose a potential constraint to the development of housing. Resources are what is available to potentially try and alleviate those constraints. Next, we look at an evaluation of the current programs and policies. So that's the 5th cycle, which we're currently in right now and will be in until we adopt the 6th cycle. And that is a look at what actions the city committed to in the 5th cycle and what the city completed, what worked really well and should be an ongoing program in the 6th cycle, and also what potentially needs to be revised or rethought in a different way. Again, there's a sites analysis process where the city will identify sites to accommodate their regional housing needs assessment, or RHNA. And then lastly, the city will set a new policy program, which is a set of actions the city commits themselves to be able to promote the development of housing and housing-related topics. This chart may be familiar to a lot of folks who have watched a couple of our presentations now, but this is the regional housing needs assessment for the city of Costa Mesa. As you can see, there are 4 income categories. They're very low, low income, moderate income, and above moderate income. Those are essentially defined as a percentage of the area median income for the county of Orange, which in 2020 was 103,000. As you can see on the far right column, you'll see the number of units the city needs to plan for in each of those income categories. And this has been finalized by SCAG, so this is the final number. Next, we'll go a little bit into the community outreach process so far. It has been a very robust community outreach process, so we'll go through the different components of it. So far to date, the housing element, we've had a virtual town hall meeting that was attended by approximately 78 to 80 total participants, which for a housing element meeting, virtually or in person, is pretty good. That took place at the end of last year. We followed up with community surveys, which we'll go into in a little bit, that got over 460 responses, individual responses, and thousands of data points over the different questions. We held the district-specific meetings in February 2021. There was a specific meeting for a breakout room for each district, as well as Spanish breakout rooms for districts 1 through 3 and 4 through 6. And then we held subject matter expert meetings with home builders, developers, housing advocacy groups, and then homeless service providers. So we'll have a little bit of the feedback that came from all of those meetings in the coming slides. All outreach meeting materials were provided in English and Spanish, and there's a good amount of information that's been put out over the city's social media, different community platforms, and online engagement, as well as the city, which is currently producing some short informational topic-based outreach videos, as was discussed the last time we came to council. These are currently in production, and they're on topics that we've heard from the community are of interest in relating to the housing element process. So a little bit on the community survey. As I mentioned earlier, we got 465 total survey responses for both the English and Spanish versions of the survey. It was available for approximately 3 months, and the questions centered around housing growth in terms of types of housing, potential housing areas at a large kind of zoomed out scale of different corridors or different types of areas. And then lastly, the community's vision for housing growth. So a little bit about what we heard in terms of types of multifamily housing that would fit best in Costa Mesa. Apartments led multi-generational and mixed-use housing by just a little bit. And this gives us a good idea of where to focus and potentially what housing types should look like when we start to look. The housing element itself does not identify housing types, but it does identify densities, which then can lend themselves to housing types based on what those densities are. So preferred areas of prioritized housing as well. Again, we looked at kind of a large zoomed out scale. We didn't ask the community at this point to identify specific parcels. We really wanted to just get an idea of where potential focus areas are. And that's important because it comes up a little bit later in the presentation as well in terms of what we've heard in the district meetings, what we heard in some of the other engagement meetings that we've had for areas that are potential growth areas that fit the community character. Because I think we've come to realize over this process that there's opportunity for growth in Costa Mesa, but it needs to be strategic, it needs to fit the community character, and it needs to be in areas that make sense for that type of growth. So what we heard from the survey was along major streets and corridors, existing neighborhoods, accessory dwelling units, which actually gets handled a little bit differently. The city makes an assumption on the number of accessory dwelling units that will be developed across the city, and because those are available in a number of different zones, the city doesn't identify a specific area for them. City-owned properties, and then older shopping centers as well. So it was fairly well distributed, with along major streets probably taking the lead in that. We also got a lot of qualitative data that we've since been able to look through and get an idea for what some of the free response answers were. So overall summary is included within the council agenda report, but major themes were location of housing. So we heard a lot about what I mentioned in terms of housing growth being applicable in Costa Mesa, but it being in strategic areas, being in areas that make sense to the community. We heard a lot of positive information on density, again, so long as it's in correct areas, as long as it's in areas that make sense for the surrounding context, and also that the density is one term referred to as gentle density, which I thought was a great term to kind of express what was being said by a lot of residents. Range of housing types. This was important, and we heard it. Oh, apologize. Heard it a number of different times, and that was that there are single-family houses and there are apartments, but there's a missing middle. There's a set of housing in there for folks who don't want a full single-family house in a yard, but also don't want to be an apartment. So considering all range of housing types to meet the community's needs. Affordability was a big component, a lack of affordable housing options within the community. And then being close to open space. We heard a lot of comments about as you start to bring in more dense developments, they generally have an open space, a required open space component, but they don't have a full yard like a single family house would. So locating density in places where open space is accessible, families can get out, they can go for a walk, quality of life can be promoted in areas like that was important. And then parking concerns for new housing. This is a concern that we hear in a lot of jurisdictions of as new housing comes in, potentially there may not be enough parking. It may spill into neighborhoods. So something to take into consideration as well. So also after that survey, we held the district meetings in February. Again, they were 46 participants on the first night and 55 on the second night, and the districts were split up 1 through 3 and 4 through 6. They focused on potential development areas, a little bit more specific than the survey. We started to nail down into specific corridors, even in some cases, actual parcels that we should be considered. But also it was a good chance to talk with residents, many of whom have been in the community 20 plus years and been in those districts 20 plus years, and get an idea of what was unique about that, what was the history of it. I know for my own district, it was interesting to hear about a lot of the overlays that are in the area and the intent of why those overlays were put into place, especially understanding going into this process, the intent of those overlays and how potentially we go forward using those. So these notes are available on the Housing Element Update website, and actually you can watch the videos from those if you would like to. So a little bit more, we talked about in the district meetings, we talked about opportunities and challenges for housing in the community. As you can see on the right, there is actually a map of District 2, and going through potentially the analysis that we talked about there, the highlighted areas, some of the areas to focus on. It was very community member driven, which was great. We did a quick presentation to kind of set the lay of the land, but it was really interesting to hear where different community members took the conversation. We always found our way, at least in the ones that I was in, to work back to housing and how this relates to our housing element update. But it was really interesting to hear about different types of services that potentially could be needed in different areas and housing types that were prevalent and what potentially was missing. So really set the vision for a future of housing, and it was good to hear some new and innovative ideas, even from the people who are newer to the area, because they came from other places where they saw different things work and could potentially work in Costa Mesa. So we also held subject matter expert meetings. I won't go through all of these, but high level, they were with home builders and developers, housing advocacy groups, and then also you'll see on the next slide, homeless service providers. The home builders and developers really highlighted some of the constraints to the development process and ways to potentially get affordable housing, also ways to development standards and parts of the overall development process that should be looked at. Housing advocacy groups focused on inclusionary housing ordinance and changes to the city's zoning. Surprisingly similar comments in terms of the need for certain types of housing and how we go about accomplishing that through the city's update process. And then the homeless service providers was really focused on ways to partner with the city, a lot about educational materials, and again, a little bit about the, how do we get people to permanent housing options? What do those housing options look like? So really, really fascinating conversation, especially the last one I really enjoyed because it was an area that I wasn't particularly an expert in, I'll say. So I got to learn a lot from that group, and I know staff did as well. So we talked last time we were, or at least last time I was in front of you, we did talk about the community outreach strategy, and we talked about coming back to about midway, evaluate the strategy, see what was working, where we potentially needed to shift to. And so we're currently doing that right now. We've realized that there's some groups that we want to make sure we check in with that maybe didn't get a chance to participate in one of those earlier options we went through. So we're going back and outreaching to those groups now. We're talking to some of the major landowners whose properties may play a big part of the housing element, just to get a sense of what their thought process is and try and set a realistic expectation within the document, so that the city's in a good spot moving forward. We're also continuing to talk to advocacy groups and continuing those conversations as well. That's important to the State Department of Housing and Community Development, that those conversations continue, and it's important to the city as well. So I'll take a quick 2-second break and say we'll go into the community profile next. We didn't pull out all the information from the community profile. It's just a couple of, I think it's 7 or 8 data points that we thought were really interesting and told a good story of the community. Obviously, when the draft document comes out, there will be a full draft of the community profile for everyone to look through. So the community profile, in a sense, as I mentioned, sets kind of the baseline for the document. It centers around current demographic, economic, and housing characteristics within the city. And data comes from multiple sources, primarily benchmarked off the US Census. Regardless of the source, they generally come from there. It is a little bit of a weird pocket that we're in because they just did the 2020 census and that data is not available. So every city in California, Sandag and Skag regions is currently benchmarking off the 2010. The community profile also informs the programs and policies and lets us know what policies and programs and where the city should commit to actions. Some different topics are going to be required. So while the data does say, a certain topic is warranted in the city or may not be, the state does require certain topics to be stressed in the program. So as we go forward and talk about that next session, we'll be able to dig a little bit more into that. So a couple of really interesting, and I like digging into these as well. So household characteristics, it's interesting. About 43% are married couple households, and then an almost equal amount, 40%, are non-family households, which are traditionally people living with roommates, people living alone, college students who are living in dormitories. They make up a good portion. I know OCC has a couple of on-campus housing opportunities, so that's a portion there. But it's interesting to see that it's almost a 50, not 50-50, but it's almost an even split between the two, with the remaining couple categories breaking into different. Some households cross multiple categories, so and then 7.5% senior housing as well. Average household size for Costa Mesa is just under the county average of 3 people per household. It's at 2.7, on par with Irvine and less than Santa Ana. This will be a trend a little bit that Santa Ana has a higher household population than most cities in Orange County. Another interesting data point is when we look at those income categories that we talked about for the regional housing needs assessment, we did an evaluation of where the city's current residents currently stand, or where at least the estimated income based on reporting is. And almost a little bit under 50% of households currently fall into the extremely low, very low, or low categories. And so, as you can see on the table, just 52.8% fall in the moderate, above moderate. So that means at least 48% or 47% are either 80% or lower of area median income for the county. This kind of tells that data point as well. You can see that the median household income for the county is $85,398. For Costa Mesa, it's just a little bit lower at $79,207. And when you look at some of the data points, some of the surrounding cities, Irvine, Newport Beach, Santa Ana, and Huntington Beach, you can see where Costa Mesa stacks up in terms of median household income. And also by breakdown, again, follows a similar trend where I believe it's just about 65% or so, if my math is correct, that make of households that make under $100,000 a year. So that's not individuals, that's a household as a whole. Oh, I skipped too quickly. Special needs groups. The housing element defines special needs groups a little bit differently than it's typically referred to. You can see a number of categories on the left-hand side there. Senior population, in terms of households, is actually in terms of people is 10.7%, and it differs a little bit from what we talked about earlier. The data point is a little different, but you can see seniors living alone in terms of households is 7.5%. Persons with disabilities, as the housing element will address ADA needs for persons with disabilities, is just about 8%, and then single parent households are 9%. Large households are also looked at because housing for large households can be difficult to find. If you don't get a single family house, apartments don't typically go larger than 2 bedrooms, sometimes 3. So having a household of 5 or more can be difficult to accommodate. Almost 10% of Costa Mesa's households are 5 or more persons. And then just about 13% of people are living in poverty. Small farm worker population, and then 193 people at the last point in time county count experiencing homelessness. Another kind of interesting statistic to look at is the overcrowding for units. Costa Mesa is at 9% of overcrowding, and this is I think defined as more than 1 person per room. So you can see that there's a number of folks who, about 9% of folks who are in that a housing situation that's defined by that. Where you can see Santa Ana's at 31%, so quite a bit higher, Irvine a little bit lower, and only, Costa Mesa is just about at the county average as well. And then last slide on this for data inserts is just looking at households by type. So you can see about 63% are single family units, whether they're detached or attached. Single family townhouses are counted in that attached category. And then multifamily is generally apartments or condominiums, and then 2.8% for mobile homes as well. I think it was interesting for when I first saw it, and we've talked about this, I think in a previous meeting as well, was that Costa Mesa is primarily renter occupied, just about 60%. Just 40% or so is owner occupied, but the remaining 60%, whether that's renting a house, an apartment, condo, whatever it may be, is quite a bit more than the owner occupied units within Costa Mesa. So with there, we're going to go into, as Jennifer mentioned, just a kind of brief overview, and really this is really to set the plate for our future discussion next month on the site's inventory analysis. This is an important part. Oh, yeah.
Sorry, I just wanted to pause there for a moment. So obviously we're presenting a lot of data this evening, and I wanted to just break in here and essentially explain a lot of this demographic data is essentially foundational for our future discussions as to housing goals and policies. So it's very important at any time that we're updating our general plan or our housing element in particular to have a really good understanding of the community's demographics and characteristics, so that we can ensure that our policies and programs are matching up with those demographics and characteristics. So although it's a heavy lift for a study session night, we thought it was really important to present that, that demographic information. So from here, we wanted to take just a quick pause to see if the council had any questions as to the information we presented so far, and then we'll move ahead into the site's inventory analysis and next steps. If there are no questions, then we'll keep going.
Let's plug ahead.
Sounds good.
Will do. Okay, so we will go into the site's inventory analysis. So the project team is currently determining the existing capacity within the city. We're looking at the characteristics and locations of existing overlays, urban plans, specific plans. As you'll see in a little bit, we go through a couple of these areas. They really are some of the, we'll call ideal or more ideal opportunities for housing. The more and more we look at these areas and the potential of these overlays and of these urban specific plans, we see that they lie in areas that are potentially good fits for higher density. They already accommodate some of the higher densities within the city. I'll show it on the next slide. But they are good areas and they're good options for the city to look at evaluating as part of this process. We looked at a lot of community feedback on potential housing locations. I went through all 6 maps, actually 7 maps of the process for the district meetings, and I've looked through the survey respondents as well. And the city needs to identify properties that are likely to develop within the planning period. So while there may be a property that is seen as, you know, a great redevelopment opportunity, if the city knows of a lease or something that goes longer than 8 years, it's a consideration we have to take into account, because that may be a site that's not, while it's a good opportunity site, may not be able to redevelop within the planning period. And that's really what the focus of this is. And then we're looking at potential zoning strategies to accommodate the city's RHNA need. So we'll walk a little bit through all of those, and again, it'll set the table for the next meeting that we're going to be at. I think what's important to notice is as we're going through, there's a lot of potential opportunity. It's really going to be how we craft it and how we do it in the best way possible to fit the community's needs and to fit the overall, you know, kind of growth patterns that Costa Mesa would like to see. So while it does seem like, as we'll go through, there may not be a lot of capacity in existing areas, I think it's important to mention that there are a number of strategies that we can implement that we've heard from the community should be implemented that can take a look at addressing this need. And there are a lot of options. It's really going to be determining how we work through it. One item to note, and then has maybe floated around in previous meetings, was this concept of a default density. And it's for HCD's planning purposes for a jurisdiction of Costa Mesa's size. 30 dwelling units an acre is the density at which the state has determined that affordable housing is likely to be built. Lower than that, and then it's determined that the product type and the density just doesn't really facilitate lower or affordable components. It doesn't mean that affordable housing can't be built at a lower density. It absolutely can. And it also doesn't mean that because something comes in at 30 dwelling units an acre, that's automatically going to be affordable. There's a number of other factors that go into that. It is just for planning purposes where HCD has sort of drawn the line. And for reference, the reason I mentioned earlier that we're looking at the overlays, urban plans, specific plans, is because the city's current residential zone that is the most dense only allows 20 dwelling units an acre. So that already presents a potential issue in terms of trying to identify sites that meet the criteria of the housing element update process. So going through, the city has a number of specific plans, urban plans, overlays, additional areas for consideration. We'll go through a quick map reminder of where some of those lie. I know I certainly needed one. But you can see, looking through these, you can see the different areas and also the densities they provide. So as we talk about that 30 dwelling unit an acre number, some of these areas already allow that. So that's why, immediately why we started to look at some of these different areas. You can look at North Costa Mesa specific plan, so Becca, the residential incentive overlays, although they're currently applied to fairly small areas, are 30 dwelling units an acre. Harbor mixed use overlay is 40. So you can see there's a number of different current overlays and specific and urban plans that do allow over that 30 dwelling unit an acre capacity. And so they already facilitate a little bit higher. And some of those areas actually already have development that is higher than those densities as well. Specific plans and urban plans allow for slightly different variations in zoning standards as well. So there may be some developments that are a little higher. Fairview Developmental Center also presents an opportunity. And I know, Jennifer, you'd wanted to mention a quick note on Fairview Developmental Center as well. There's 582 dwelling units currently planned in the general plan, but I believe the city's had some additional conversations.
Absolutely. Thanks, Nick. So as the city council may know already, the city has been engaged in conversations with the state as to the future of the Fairview site. And although there are 582 units identified in the general plan now as of 2016, that's potential development capacity for the site. There's obviously been continued discussions, including through the council ad hoc committee for additional housing opportunities at Fairview. So 1,200 dwelling units at the site was mentioned as part of those conversations with the state. And at some point, the state had mentioned even 2,500 units as being appropriate for that site potentially. So obviously, when COVID hit, those conversations were postponed a bit, but certainly they are intended to be reactivated. And the city has a very active role to play in re-engaging the state on those conversations for the Fairview site. So it's certainly an opportunity that we're taking a look at through the housing element process.
Thank you. So just a little reminder on where some of those areas are. As you can see, the current residential incentive overlay applies to a few parcels. And then there's the Subica urban plan. North Costa Mesa takes up a lot of this area north of the 405. And then there's a couple of properties like Sakioka and Home Ranch as well. And as we start to move sort of towards the coast, Fairview Developmental Center, the Newport Boulevard specific plan, some of the harbor mixed use, and again, some additional residential incentive overlays. And then the residential ownership overlay as well. So as you start to move into, say, the west side with Newport running down right about here, you can see the 19 West specific plan and how it splits into a couple different areas and how these are sort of segmented out. So you can see there's a number of different overlays and urban plans that are currently existing within the city that we can take a look at as part of this process. So one thing to note is when we look at those and we look at the capacity that's been planned for with the densities that we talked about earlier, it gets us to about 4,000 units, a little bit above 4,000 units. The arena need for the city, as mentioned earlier, is about 11,760. So what we're showing in this table is only the potential housing units within the overlays and urban plan areas that we talked about. It's not the potential capacity within the entire city. It doesn't look at, as Jennifer mentioned, Fairview Developmental Center as a potential housing opportunity. It doesn't address accessory dwelling units. It doesn't address any other strategies that we would take a look at as part of the housing element update process in terms of revising zoning or taking a look at specific areas. This is just current need and kind of what it is now. And it shows the remaining need that would exist if we were to only identify those parcels. So clearly it shows a shortfall and that the current zoning is not able to get us to where we need to go. Therefore, we look at potential options going forward about how we identify additional capacity. So with there, I'll go into opportunities and considerations. And I want to preface this conversation, and I promise you I have 7 slides left, so bear with me. With just going back into a little bit of what we heard from the community, both in the community survey and the district meetings. Community survey talked about older shopping centers, city-owned properties and major streets being some of the top 3. ADUs were up there as well, but as I mentioned, the city analyzes that a little bit differently. They take a look at the past couple of years of development of ADUs, some of the new state laws that have come in that promote development of ADUs and expand where they can be put, and then makes a projection based off of that. So we'll have a little bit more on that projection in the next meeting that we have with you. And in district meetings, we heard a lot about consider impacts of traffic, locations of existing neighborhoods, how new housing relates and kind of interacts with existing neighborhoods, proximity to open space. We heard a lot about industrial areas like Logan Ave, airport area, West Side Costa Mesa as potential housing opportunities. When we do that, we need to look at access to transit and services, as was also mentioned. Major corridors like Bristol Street, Harbor, and Newport were all thrown in there as well. Again, this is all community, straight from community feedback. So this is what we're hearing from the community, and then maybe one person's opinion and maybe multiple people's opinions, but it's what we're hearing as we go through the meetings. Mixed use and live work in smaller commercial corridors like 19 West and 17 East were brought up as well. Diversity between renter and ownership opportunities. I think the city already has a good amount of that, but continuing that. And then again, evaluating the existing overlays, urban plans, specific plans for community goals and effectiveness. If they were put in place and to serve a certain purpose, I think the evaluation to say whether they're still serving that purpose or whether they can be amended in any way to potentially increase their effectiveness is definitely an approach, something to do as part of this housing element process. And then again, the comment on missing middle housing and gentle density, the idea that it doesn't have to be, there certainly needs to be a look at these larger densities, and there will be single family in Costa Mesa, obviously, but there's a middle component as well that needs to be looked at and considered as part of this process. So as we look at potential strategies, again, I keep harking back to the specific plans, urban plans areas, but really an evaluation of those is the first step. It's proving to be what will be the first step. And we've shown that current capacity doesn't quite hold what we need. So we can look at a few things. We can look at revising certain densities allowed in those. And it may not be the entire area, it may just be a portion, but it may increase capacity that way. You can also apply the overlays to new areas. So as you saw on the map, they're fairly kind of spread out, and the maps are a little bit in terms of where they show that the different areas, because there was islands and they exclude mobile home parks and things like that, it may look at expanding where those areas potentially could be, and then just amending specific plan and urban plan boundaries as well to potentially encompass additional parcels. So all options the city could look at as ways to increase capacity. The city could also create a new residential overlay that permits development at 30 dwelling units an acre and figure out strategic locations to put that. The city could do it as, say, an affordable housing overlay that could look at attaching affordability as a component to certain densities. They can look at applying the process to commercial areas, transit corridors adjacent to open space. All the areas that we heard from the community during the outreach process were important areas to take a look at and to consider as part of this update process. It would be a very focused identifying effort to say where this overlay is, depending on how it was composed, makes sense. It's also important to note that as part of the housing element, we just need to identify areas and densities. That is what's most important as part of the housing element update process. There will be a program to then look at the overall composition, development standards, things like that for new overlays or potential revisions to other overlays. So we need to have an idea of what those are. We don't need to have them fully fleshed out, that the city has a couple years after adoption to be able to fully work out and make sure that those make sense. If they differ from what the housing element said, potentially they have to go back and amend the housing element, but hopefully they were, whatever we consider is well thought through and gives consideration to the housing element update process so that nothing like that needs to occur. And so cities also heard a lot about Measure Y. And while there's still plenty of ongoing discussions that the city is having and research the city is doing, Measure Y is determined it may present a challenge to the city obtaining a compliant housing element. It may apply to rezones needed to meet the state mandated RHNA allocation. And those rezones again would occur after the housing element adoption. And adopting and maintaining a compliant housing element in the context of Measure Y is an important issue that warrants continued conversations within Costa Mesa, including with housing advocates, property owners, city staff, and officials. So those conversations are continuing to happen as we go through this process. I wanted to touch really briefly on the concept of no net loss as well. Some folks may be familiar with Senate Bill 166 and no net loss. And essentially what it means is, the city is going to identify sites that have enough capacity to accommodate their RHNA need, their regional housing needs allocation. And essentially, as the city over the next 8 years develops units, housing units, that number will go down. So that number is the goal starting off, and as the city starts to develop, the number will go down. The city always needs to maintain an inventory of sites that is above what that RHNA number is. So that is the concept of no net loss. If you fall below that number, then the city has 180 days to find additional capacity through identification of more sites. So kind of like a mini update to the housing element to go through and identify additional sites. So as part of this, we try and make as realistic of assumptions as possible. We don't want to take a site and identify it for a certain number of affordable housing or lower income units if we know that a property owner has no intent of developing that for that level. It just puts the city in a position where potentially when that property does redevelop, the city has a lowered buffer and potentially gets closer to no net loss. So if the city cannot find additional sites to identify and analyze, which I don't think would be the case, or can't get approval on the sites they do identify, housing element would be out of compliance at that point. Typically, HCD does try and work with cities before that happens in sort of a last-ditch situation, but it is a very real possibility. And so a little bit on, as my last slide, housing element non-compliance. So these are a few of the options, a few of the things that could happen if the city does not have a compliant housing element. Potential loss of eligibility for certain future state grant funds, which are extremely important to the city. We touched on a little bit earlier of some of the infrastructure improvements and some of the processes the city goes through and relies on that state funding for. Loss of some level of local control over development. This potentially could happen if a court orders that the city just start to approve projects because they don't have a compliant housing element. HCD may forward a non-compliance case to the Office of the Attorney General, in which case a court may suspend the city's authority to issue building permits or other approvals And then lastly, it opens up the city to be sued by outside groups on just the mere fact of not having a compliant housing element. So a number of number of potential possibilities that we would like to avoid and obviously do not want to have the city subjected to. So lastly, we have a couple next steps. Continued community outreach. As I mentioned, informational videos will be released on social media platforms on the city's website pertaining to housing related topics that the community has termed are important. We'll continue to have focused meetings as well. We are meeting with housing advocacy groups, property owners, and any other groups that we've identified or have come forward and expressed an interest in talking to the city about housing. The city has taken a number of meetings over the past couple of weeks and gotten a lot of really good information out of those. We're going to finalize the draft constraints and resources. A big part of the resources is sites. So that is a big portion of that section. The sites analysis will definitely be a topic and we'll continue to research and push forward on as we go through over the next month or so. Housing policies and programs, that really is the program or the plan that the city sets for the actions they're going to take relating to housing. Draft versions of all of these documents. And I do stress draft at this point because they are very much so as they are reviewed by the public, as they're reviewed by members of city council and outside advocacy groups. Anybody who is a stakeholder will review the document or have the opportunity to. A joint planning commission city council study session is currently being planned for April. And then following that, and following feedback on the materials presented, a release of a public review draft document sometime in early summer. That document will be available for 30 days for the community to comment on. There will be a planned workshop in there to explain the document and explain how to read it, make sure everybody has an understanding of what's being described in there. And then following the feedback we receive and incorporation of that and consideration of that, the document will go to HCD for state mandated 60-day review. HCD has 60 days to review the document and provide comments back to the city. So they will do that. They will provide a essentially comment memo back. I've never seen a city submit a housing element the first time and have no letter come back and just get approved automatically. It just doesn't happen. So there will be a letter that comes back, but after that, staff will work with HCD and obviously with you and members of the community to refine a document and do a final draft housing element and local adoption for, as I mentioned, for housing elements within the SCAG region, which is the Southern California Association of Governments, is October 15th of this year. So with that, thank you so much for listening to all of that. I'll pass it back to Jennifer now.
Thank you very much, Nick. So in closing, Mayor Pro Tem and Council, really from staff's perspective, the work that we're doing now is identifying the high-level housing policies and programs and a high-level housing strategy for how the city wants to and needs to move forward in the future to meet its RHNA allocation. So what the housing element does is really lay out that blueprint for what we'd like to see moving forward. And the city has, as Nick mentioned, 3 years following housing element adoption to implement some of the changes in policies or programs or our housing strategies that we would like to see moving forward. So this housing element, although it's certainly it's a heavy lift and it's an important part of our long-range planning process, it's also in many respects the beginning of the housing conversation. These housing conversations will need to go on for a few years after until we sort of get these programs and policies and strategies in place. So what we're here to do this evening is really to provide you with some demographic information and sort of the lay of the land and really the foundational information that ultimately you'll need to provide staff some guidance as to the direction you'd like to go ultimately with our housing strategy. So our next housing element study session, we do intend to be a joint City Council and Planning Commission study session in April. And at that meeting is really the time where we wanted to give you a little time to sort of take in the information we presented this evening and then ultimately come back to you in April to have a little bit more detailed conversation about what that housing strategy and those housing policies and programs will look like. So I think that's our presentation this evening. So we'd like to open it up for council questions and any feedback that you may have.
Thank you, Ms. Lee, and thank you, Mr. Chen. That was a really good presentation. I think we're actually going to open it up for public comments first, and then council will have a chance to ask questions after that. So if you're in the audience and you'd like to speak to this item, please use the hand raise option on your screen. If you're joining the meeting on your phone and would like to speak, please press *9 to raise your hand. And then when I call your phone number, you'll press *6 to be able to be unmuted. So go ahead and raise your hand if you're in the audience, and we'll go ahead and start with Ms. Esfahani.
Hello, thank you. That really was a terrific presentation. And I think it's a tribute to the listening skill and the openness of the staff and the consultant, because I participated in, and other members of our Affordable Housing Coalition participated in a lot of the community outreach events and heard these ideas come from the community. And so it's great to see them reflected here in the report. Obviously, the RHNA challenge for the city is huge, and particularly in terms of meeting the need for affordable housing for lower income families and households. We have some major policy suggestions. I know it's really the beginning of the conversation for you all. So I'll just touch briefly on what we think are about the 6 most important ideas that can help Costa Mesa meet its RHNA challenge and meet the desperate need for affordable housing of the community. The first is to adopt a highly effective inclusionary housing ordinance. We believe an excellent model is the one that the city of Irvine uses. And we think it's especially important to have an in-lieu fee that is high enough to encourage developers to actually include affordable units in their developments rather than to opt to pay the fee. Irvine does that, and it's producing a lot of affordable housing. The second is to amend Measure Y so it does not constrain the building of affordable housing. And alternatively, we believe that the city should interpret Measure Y as it's currently written as exempting from the voter approval requirement all developments which make at least 20% of their units affordable to low and very low income households. Obviously, that's a legal issue for your city attorney to look into, but we urge you to do that. Third is to create a specific plan for the 100-acre Fairview developmental site, which would have much increased density, up to at least 60 units to the acre, and with at least 20% of all units affordable to low and very low income households. I love to hear that there are ongoing talks, or at least before the pandemic, there were ongoing talks with the state about this and about increasing the number of units available for that site. We urge you, the coalition urges the council to continue those conversations and lobby the governor strongly to donate the land to the city, to a housing land trust, so it could be used for affordable housing. The coalition also supports the idea of creating new overlay zones along major thoroughfares like Harbor Boulevard, where mixed use development can replace some of the aging strip malls with more vibrant new communities of apartments, restaurants, and small businesses, incorporating walking and bike trails, and having at least 20% of the housing in these overlays to be affordable for lower income households. We encourage you to review and amend all specific and urban plans and overlays in the city to include increased densities of 60 units per acre and a requirement that at least 20% of the units be affordable for lower income households. And our last 2 items are to create a housing trust fund to hold the in lieu fees that should be generated by the new inclusionary ordinance, and create a land trust to hold donated land, hopefully Fairview Developmental Center. So thank you so much for listening. We look forward to working with the council in creating affordable housing opportunities in the city.
Thank you so much, Ms. Esfahani. Mr. Clem, you're next.
Hi, my name is Aaron Clem. I live and vote in Costa Mesa. I wanted to bring to City Council's attention that the staff report does not mention the city's obligations to affirmatively further fair housing. That was a law passed in 2018, AB 686. The plan, as published in the agenda item, appears to concentrate affordable housing on state land, unused and vacant parcels, and conflicts with the requirements of AFFH law. Particularly concerning for me was the summary of survey results that commanded the city do not touch single-family neighborhoods. This comment is directly connected to racist and exclusionary practices and outcomes. Up until the 1950s, Orange County was a sundown county. And single-family zoning has been thoroughly documented as having racist intent and has been, unfortunately, very effective at achieving those outcomes. I would second Ms. Esfahani's comments about Measure Y. City Council should direct the city attorney to remove the cloud around that. There are clearly conflicts in that. The authors of Measure Y did say the quiet part out loud in their own measure language, so it shouldn't be that much of a legal analytical process to analyze that measure against state law. And then my last point here is finally, there are a limited number of things that local government elected officials can do to address the climate crisis, like joining community choice energy programs, adopting REACH energy codes, and promoting electric vehicles. However, policies to accelerate urban infill housing are far more effective than any of those other actions. City Council should direct staff and consultants to affirmatively further fair housing in compliance with state law, to include missing middle housing, ministerially approved on objective criteria in all districts and all base zoning areas, as a response to both the housing emergency and the climate emergency. That's all.
Thank you so much for those comments. Mr. Whitfield, you're next.
Hi, good evening. I only had a couple comments. One was, has any investigation been done to see if the existing infrastructure is capable of supporting the density increases that are going to be developed as part of the SCAG report? Also, I just wanted to comment on a couple other things too. So the idea of putting in affordable housing is a beautiful, wonderful idea. The reality of it is those affordable housing units will never be built by a developer in the city of Costa Mesa if we're talking about 20% of those units being affordable, because it doesn't make financial sense. So the only way to potentially do that would be to write it into the zoning code. But if we write it into the zoning code, nobody's going to build them. So it's only going to continue to increase the lack of affordable housing within that area. And I was listening to the Planning Commission study session the other night, and I believe it was Byron who brought it up, and I believe he's right. The only way that you're going to be able to have 10% or meet that SCAG requirement is if you have about 60,000 new units in the city of Costa Mesa, because the only way to make it financially feasible is to lower the affordable housing level to about 10%, but you'd have to have such increase in density for the city to be able to make that financially workable with any developer within the area. So I think some careful thought needs to be put into that. And the same thing applies to in lieu of fees. If we go down the road of in lieu of fees, you're going to run into the same issues. And unfortunately, you can look at the city of Los Angeles. They have in lieu of fees for a lot of their developments in order to try and increase affordable housing. And I think a large portion of the population is exiting LA County and moving to other areas, specifically because of the policies that we're talking about currently. So I think we need to be very careful and thoughtful in terms of what we are trying to achieve. and the best way to possibly do that, because what we're talking about here are some of the suggestions that I heard earlier that they're just not. I just want to be. I'm not trying to be dismissive. They're not going to work. So that's my only suggestion. And I think some serious thought should be considered for potentially talking to other municipalities and suing the state based on the housing unit requirements that are being delivered to the city and told to accommodate. I'd just be curious about the constitutionality of that. And the reality is that's the numbers that they're talking about aren't really based on any facts or any real data to support it. These are just wish list items that really don't make a whole lot of sense. So those are my only comments. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. If you'd like to speak to this item, please use the raise hand option on your screen. If you're joining the meeting on your phone and would like to speak, please press *9 to raise your hand and then *6 to speak when your number is called. Mr. Rutherford.
Good evening, Council. I hope you're all staying well. You know my passion for this issue, so I appreciate the opportunity to provide comments to you tonight. This council majority only does amazing work, so I know you're up for the challenge of meeting the high RHNA number and the challenge of the housing crisis that's facing our community. I really disagree with some of the commentary that's been out there about suing the state and using legal means to push back against the RHNA. I think that's been futile so far, and I don't think it's a wise use of city resources. So I hope the council will not go down that path of legally challenging the state. I hope we'll instead move forward in a more productive and constructive way. I'm also a resident, a member of the Affordable Housing Coalition. I hope you take seriously and you read the letter that Kathy Esfahani sent to you. I think it has really amazing points that you should consider moving forward. I also think it's helpful to frame the discussion around our housing needs with some history. The original RHNA and housing element law that was passed in 1969 was a success of the civil rights movement, designed to prevent local communities from perpetuating racial segregation by zoning out affordable housing. And the recent legislation from the state has outlawed teeth to RHNA, in what I believe is an effort to fulfill the original spirit and intent of the law. And I hope you could carry that intent forward in Costa Mesa. So again, I hope you read the letter that Kathy sent, and I appreciate your time tonight. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Ms. McDonald, you're next.
For a really great.
You are cutting out a little bit right now. Cynthia?
Hey.
Well, barely. Try again. Nope, you might want to try calling in. Ms. Green, let's go to the next speaker, Linda.
Good evening, council members. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay, my name is Linda, and I really want to start off by saying that I believe there's an opportunity to make a significant impact in how we shape housing needs for the next 8 years. Creating a plan for an 8-year timeframe is a substantial amount of time. We need to be strategic and thoughtful in how we can achieve our high RHNA goals. And we can really start by creating long-term and effective policies such as inclusionary housing. It's also important to consider that as we discuss overlays and density, we should keep in mind that HCD's default density or even higher density doesn't necessarily produce affordable housing. Density and effective housing policies should really go hand in hand. And these policies such as by right development for 100% affordable developments, or even a set aside of 20% affordability should be created in order for these higher densities to be more effective in producing affordable housing. Instead of just giving away development standards, incentives, or concessions that significantly increases the value of property, the city should request for community benefits such as affordable housing in return. In regards to the comment on inclusionary and in lieu fees that doesn't work, I really suggest that, I mean, there is time in this process, and I really suggest that staff take some time to research some cities that have been really successful in building affordable housing with these policies. These cities are our neighbors, such as Irvine, Santa Ana, even Huntington Beach. I also wanted to touch on the need to strengthen the protections of mobile homeowners and long-term mobile residents from future potential displacement. The city has a good mobile home conversion ordinance if you guys are interested in looking into that. I also want to take this time to really let council know that I'm very encouraged by this housing element process and want to recognize city staff for their efforts. As you know, like housing element to a lot of people is really boring, but this process is a monster. And city staff has done a tremendous job in outreach and capturing our input and what we envision for our community. I want to thank you for your time and really look forward to continuing these housing conversations to provide inclusive housing for everyone.
I'm having internet problems. I can't get to the phone number.
Thank you. All right, Cynthia, you want to try again? We could hear you just now.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Okay. Good evening. And thank you to staff for a great presentation. At last night's Planning Commission meeting, one of the commissioners asked a really important question, and it's the same question that I've been asking for years. Where is the vision of Costa Mesa? What is the image of what our city will look like in 10, 15, or 20 years from now? And that's the problem that, you know, should have been working on for years now, but it seems that that project was the proverbial can that got kicked down the road, but now the can is right before us. And we're confronted with the problem of a large RHNA number and then needing to come up with a plan to satisfy that assessment. As noted in the staff report, the Planning Commission has made some good comments, a few of which I'm going to note. The first is the importance of recognizing that noncompliance with RHNA or state laws will have consequences such as losing local control and streamlining the projects without local input. Note that streamlining projects won't get a CEQA analysis. So any protections to the environment, mitigation of traffic, et cetera, won't be available to the city. The second is consideration of clustering development in appropriate locations while maintaining open space and the potential for a transfer of development rights policy. We do need to locate housing in the right spots, and the lack of open space in the city needs to be finally addressed, particularly as housing becomes more dense, and it will become more dense. Finally, consideration of policies that lead to a variety of housing types and designs that are compatible with the Costa Mesa fabric and meet the needs of various populations in terms of household type, age, and income groups. That's something the residents have been requesting since about 2013, when we last started our general plan update. Now, part of that is an inclusionary housing ordinance. So in order to get to where we want to be, we need to know where we're going. A vision of Costa Mesa is needed now before it's too late and decisions are made for us. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Is there anyone else wishing to speak to this item? You can raise your hand or press *9 on your phone. I think that is it. Public comments are now closed. City Council, if you have questions or comments, go ahead and raise your hand and then unmute yourself when I call on you. Councilmember Chavez.
Thank you, Mayor Potemar. It's a bit hard when you're not with us speaking because you always go first with great questions. So I'll do my best to copy you a little bit, emulate you as we ask these questions. So I'm going to go over a few things we're going over in that report, because I think it's very important for our community to understand exactly what we're trying to address here. We're trying to plan for the future. We're trying to plan where we're going to build housing. And I want to reiterate a few points that were in a staff report. So the first one, which is very simple, is what are the negative consequences if we do not have a complying RHNA allocation or a housing element?
How about if I start, and Nick, if you want to throw anything in that I missed, we can do that. So a non-compliant housing element basically means that the city cannot issue any discretionary approvals or building permits. And when I say building permits, I mean building permits, all building permits. The only thing that we might end up being forced to issue would be approvals for housing developments that might otherwise not comply with our code. And that is one of the things that could happen. Typically, the HCD will work with this, as I think Mr. Chen pointed out at the beginning. But if they see that we are not moving forward and getting our housing element into compliance appropriately, they will take action. It will basically prevent any development other than housing and other than housing that we want in the city. Nick, did I leave anything out?
I think just a few things that I noted in the presentation. You got, I think, a lot of them, loss of local control. One that wasn't noted in the presentation was the potential for fines. The state could fine the city as well.
Thank you.
I left that one on my presentation as well. And then I think everything else was mostly in the presentation regarding non-compliance.
Yeah, they typically will start with fines. Thank you for reminding me of that, Mr. Chen. They will typically start with fines, and it gets more punitive as time goes on.
So basically, the fines get bigger and bigger as we're not in compliance, right?
Yes, and then the longer we're out of compliance, the more likely it is that they will pull the plug on our ability to issue permits.
Okay, and then I think I'm oh, go ahead.
Councilmember Chavez, do you mind if I jump in for one quick second? I just wanted to follow up to a question for Ms. Barlow. So when you talk about issuance of building permits, does that apply only to new applications or to those that are in plan check and prior approvals?
Everything, anything.
Okay, so
the only thing that they might allow us to do is if we did have a compliant housing development that would, that would further the goals of our housing element, they might allow us to move that one forward.
Okay, so to put a fine point on it for the public, if a project had been approved years earlier, was going through the plan check process, was ready to break ground, that applicant conceivably could not be able to proceed because we have a non-compliant housing element.
Correct.
And then next question is, then we potentially open ourselves up to liability for that.
Theoretically, if the state won't let us issue building permits, we probably have, theoretically, we have immunity from that, but that doesn't mean that people won't sue us. It happens all the time.
Right.
And moreover, I think the important thing is that it really just stalls any improvements in the community.
Okay. Thank you for indulging me, Councilmember Chavez.
Of course, Councilmember Harlan. I think that's a good segue because I've read before, and I could be wrong in this, so I want to confirm it. So the state could also pull funding for us to do street improvements. Is that correct?
Yes.
Or capital improvements? Correct.
Mr. Chen specifically mentioned that they could withhold all different kinds of funding. It could be gas tax funding. It could be grants for parks. It could be, there's just so many different funding mechanisms that are available to us through a variety of state funds. And, any of those could be at risk.
Man, that would suck, paying more for gas, the gas tax and not be able to get benefit out of it. Going on that point, I think this is the big elephant in the room, and I kind of just want to, again, get the air out for the public. How do we anticipate exactly that Measure Y will conflict with having a functioning housing element? What area in particular with Measure Y makes it so we're more at risk and not being able to comply?
Oh, well, there's lots of things. And I always hate to be a naysayer. Sometimes I feel like I'm just, it's just negative stuff always pouring out of my mouth. But Measure Y imposes a very significant a constraint on development of housing. The housing units that can be built without Measure Y approval is quite small. Measure Y has that 5-year backward looking provision that requires us to accumulate impacts from other projects in an area of a proposed development that really magnifies the impact substantially. The affordable housing exemption that is in Measure Y, unfortunately, and if somebody can tell me as a lawyer that it's easy to solve this problem, I'm delighted to hear your answer, because I don't have it. Measure Y does exempt affordable housing projects that are required by state or federal law. Unfortunately, at least at the moment, there is no law that requires affordable housing projects. We have the RHNA numbers, and we have, various goals and other things that we're supposed to met, but there's actually no quantified number of affordable housing units that, in theory, if a project was 100% affordable, we could say, well, that might fall within the Measure Y exception, except that the Measure Y exception is not actually defined in Measure Y. It simply says required by state or federal law. So I suppose if the state were to give us land, and the condition of that land grant was you must build so many units of affordable housing, that potentially could be an exception. But that would be a contractual restriction as opposed to a state law restriction. So you see why it's not as simple as it might appear. So it would be nice if we had some clarification as to what that exemption exactly is supposed to cover. But right now it isn't really clear.
Okay, thank you. I know it's hard to answer that question, and because it's so open-ended, but I think it's important for us to have these discussions openly about what we're dealing with in our code, and I think that's very helpful, Kim. Thank you for that, or Ms. Barlow. Going on to staff, we had a few talks about inclusionary ordinance, and I know it's been in the works for some time, at least internally. Do we have a date set for when we'll discuss it on the dais? Because I know in my district, at least, it's a very popular idea.
Yes, Councilmember Chavez. The council provided staff with direction to prepare an inclusionary housing ordinance for council consideration at a prior study session. Staff has retained a consultant, Kaiser Marston, who is essentially has expertise in exactly inclusionary housing ordinances, and we have them under contract to assist us in preparing an ordinance that is specific to Costa Mesa and works for Costa Mesa. So our intention has always been to prepare the ordinance concurrently with the housing element so that we can have some of these inclusionary housing discussions at the same time as the housing element, and then a little bit as a follow-up to the housing element as we start talking about some of our future zoning actions as well. So we don't have a precise date, but it's in progress now, and we expect to get it to you soon.
Okay, so basically, like it's following our process with this housing element, and the appropriate time we'll bring it up to help alleviate us with those lower numbers for RHNA, for lower income. Okay. And again, I think it's important for public to understand, over 48% of our city is under the 80th percentile for moderate income in Orange County. So really half of our community, half of our city would need these housing elements, need these low income, moderate low income, very low income housing to continue living in our city. And I know a lot of us don't want to see our neighbors leave because of housing costs continue to go up when they have homes and ties to our community. And alongside that, I think it's a good segue, I think, for another big issue in my district, which is the Mesa West residential ownership overlay. We saw earlier in the map that Mr. Chen put up that in my district, and it's predominantly my district, if you live in an apartment, by right, you could be evicted for a condominium. That's not something that's very popular in my community, because essentially we're removing low income for income that the people in my district cannot afford. I want to put this out there to city staff that perhaps we should change that overlay to not be about ownership, but about density. Earlier in this presentation, we heard a lot about how we require how we need 30 units per acre for density to be really affordable housing. Ultimately, my district is lower income and we need more affordable housing. And I think in tandem with a inclusionary ordinance, if we're going to have redevelopment happen in my district, which, you know, unfortunately might have to happen, at the very least, we can ensure that those who are going to come into our district are those in a similar situation. And we're not tacitly removing lower income community members from my district. That's very important to me and very important to my community, because we have felt targeted by this overlay. We have felt like we do not belong because it's overlay. And I don't know if that was the intention of the overlay when it was passed, but that's how we feel. And that's why I was elected, because people felt that we had changed this. So I think as we look forward to this housing element, maybe changing that to density, and maybe changing any ownership in Costa Mesa plan to be density plan, because ultimately we have a high number to hit for RHNA, and we should hit that number while balancing the needs of our current constituents. And I think the last thing I want to ask, and this was addressed earlier, and I just want to repeat it again for sake of discussion, is we mentioned that about 10% of our city is overcrowded. Mr. Chen, you mind explaining one more time what that means exactly, but overcrowded?
Yeah, absolutely. So that the definition of overcrowded, I believe it's defined with how we evaluated it, was more than one person per bedroom in a household. So
Okay.
In situations where you have roommates or you have other, families who have households that don't have enough rooms and they're sharing, that's the general situation.
So a question I have with that, and please clarify this for me. So I'm thinking of, when I was a kid growing up, right? Like my parents were married, there's two parents and there was me and we had 2 bedrooms. Would I have been classified as overcrowded under that situation, under that like classification?
Yeah, I think it might be a bit more nuanced, but yeah, I think technically
Okay.
it would have qualified.
Okay, just interesting. Because I know in my district, there are a lot of people that are overcrowded. So I'm just kind of curious what the actual definition was.
Mm-hmm.
But for the time being, that's it. I do have one last question that I think is important to clarify one more time before we go to the next speaker. But can you please explain a bit more in detail why it's important to have 30 acres per unit opposed to 20 that we currently have in Costa Mesa? And that's my last question.
Absolutely, yeah. So as I mentioned, the 30 dwelling units an acre is the default density established by the state. It is a statewide establishment. So for of that density, so there are certain jurisdictions that are under, I believe it's, I want to say 25,000 people or so, and have a smaller, are located outside a major area that have different characteristics that are 20 dwelling units an acre, some that are 25, just for a jurisdiction the size of Costa Mesa and being in the metropolitan statistical area that it's in, that number has been set at 30 units an acre. As one caller mentioned, or one commenter mentioned, it doesn't mean that means when something gets built at 30 units, it'll be affordable, or that affordable housing can't be built at a lower density. It's just for planning purposes, it's the density that's been set.
And I would just add, Councilmember Chavez, that as we mentioned in the staff report, as well as the presentation, the city's base zoning district, the highest density allowed by our base residential zoning districts in Costa Mesa is 20 dwelling units per acre. So when we're talking about densities at which affordable housing units are created by the market, and we look at our RHNA allocation that has essentially, close to 5,000 units that were allocated as affordable housing units, we're really looking to just a few areas of the city that are identified in specific plans or urban plans that have that higher density that could even be counted. So that's really what is making up our math issue in terms of meeting our RHNA allocation. So it's an important distinction. 30 dwelling units per acre is the default density by the state. It doesn't magically create affordable housing, but it's the density at which the market begins to create affordable housing on its own.
Yeah, and I think, just to end on with this, a speaker mentioned that the importance of like having market profit margin for developers, because ultimately, as we understand it, to them it's a business of building housing and the able to profit. And it's our goal, the council, to make sure all residents, including low-income residents, have a place to live that's affordable to them. So it almost behooves us, if we're really passionate about our lower-income community members, to have a density that's going to enable developers to build development that they can profit off of, so they can build it but still have a caveat for those of us who are lower income to still live in the city. So I know it's a hard thing to mention, more density, but in some ways, if we really care about our lower income community members in Costa Mesa, and I know I do in my district and my city, that's something that we should probably be looking at more deeply. So thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Chavez. Councilmember Harper.
Yeah, thank you. And I wasn't overcrowding with my older brother sharing a room. I want to make that point. I'm just joking. I wanted to, the rest of these are questions. I only have questions just to understand. The first one is about the penalties or the jeopardizing dollars related to non-compliant housing element. That refers to the plan itself, correct? And the process itself, not whether we've built homes or not, and whether developers actually built them or not. Is that correct? Did I have that right? Or no?
That's correct.
You're correct.
The city is not obligated. I'm sorry, Mr. Chen, I didn't mean it.
No, absolutely. Go ahead.
The city's not obligated to build housing. The city is obligated to plan for and zone for housing that meets those requirements. So if our general plan doesn't allow sufficient places and numbers, or our zoning doesn't allow for the development of those sufficient numbers, that's when we're out of compliance.
That's when we're out of compliance. So no penalty will occur as long as we do that, meet those requirements, even if nobody ever builds. Is that correct?
Theoretically, yes, that's correct.
I just want to make sure I understand it. Yeah.
The difficulty is, and we didn't talk about this down at this level of detail, but Measure Y probably would require a vote on zoning that would comply with what we're required to do in our housing element. And so if the voters were to defeat that kind of zoning that we needed to complete to bring our housing element into compliance, then we would be, as they say, between a rock and a hard place.
I see. So, and page 4 of the report, it talks about progress being measured by housing construction permits. And if the adequate progress is not reported, SB 35 could be enacted. Does SB 35 have penalties in it, or is that where they take away certain rights or force us to approve certain things? Have I got that right?
I'm sorry, which page is that on?
I'm referring to page 4, the second paragraph. Progress is not reported. SB 35, 2017 could be enacted as described later in this report.
Yeah, and Councilmember Harper, I think Mr. Chen can provide council with a little background on SB 35 and how exactly it applies.
Okay.
Yeah, so SB 35 actually currently applies to the city already. It's already, when you say enacted, it's already enacted.
Okay.
Currently projects that provide, because the city did a good job of meeting its 5th cycle RHNA, which was admittedly much lower than the 6th cycle. The state has determined that Costa Mesa has done a good job developing housing so far. And so they basically, what SB 35 reads is there's a couple different affordability levels, but it's revolved around streamlining of projects. So currently, if a project comes in with 50% affordable component, they can they can ask the city for the SB 35 streamlining provisions to streamline the development of the project, but it's only if they have a 50% affordable component. The city annually reports its progress, its building progress, through the annual progress reports. If the state determines that the city is not proportionately meeting its need, essentially, they can drop that to the next bracket, which is 10%. So there are a number of cities in California that are already in that 10% bracket. Costa Mesa currently is in the 50% bracket.
Yeah, and I'd say it's essentially one of the ways when we refer to loss of local control, this is one of the ways that we can lose local control.
That we would lose it, right? And it's referring to not, it looks like low income housing, right? We're not meeting those requirements, but those are actual constructed units, correct? Or not constructed units?
Constructed units.
It's construction, monitoring of constructed units, yeah.
Yeah, okay. Tell me, I tried to look this up before the meeting. We talk about affordable housing. Is there a cost and a rent value associated with what is affordable housing, for my clarification?
There is. Nick, I think you might have had it in one of your slides. I don't know if that you're able to pull that up and kind of walk us through.
I saw the low income, but I didn't see what a rent value is for affordable housing or a cost for affordable housing is.
Absolutely. Just one
Okay.
second.
We may not have had rent values in that table, but we'll take a quick look. If
And
not,
while-
send it to the council separately.
Yeah, while he's looking for that, it's really a function of how many people are in the household, what the income is for that household, and what level of affordability we're talking about. There are different income levels for different housing sizes, household sizes. Right.
Yeah,
there you
and
go.
the city attorney is absolutely correct. This is assuming a hypothetical family of 4. It is a sliding scale depending on the number of people in the household.
Okay. How many affordable units do we have in Costa Mesa now? Do we know? And you shouldn't have that answer, but I'm just curious if we know.
I would, I think, lean on city staff for maybe an estimate. We may have to come back to you with that.
Yeah, that's something that's difficult to track over time. Certainly there's 2 types of what we would call affordable units. There's deed restricted affordable units that are essentially under contract to remain affordable. And then there are units that, because of the virtue of density and just how the market resulted in their construction, fall into affordable categories. So we absolutely track the deed restricted units, but those units that fall within affordable categories on their own are a little bit harder to track. So we can provide some kind of information about the percentage of households that fall in these different income categories, but number of existing Costa Mesa residential units that fall in the categories is a harder question to answer.
Mrs. Shabi, did you have something to add?
Yes, I just wanted to add that the deed restricted units is something that we keep track of annually, and those are under the density bonus requirements and under contracts that are typically 20 to 25 years, and they're roughly about 140 units.
Okay, thank you. Last thing, and I guess this happens, I'm not sure when this is. One of the members of the public brought this up. He's asking about how we support this increase in housing, and I did some quick math, and at 2.7 per dwelling unit, 2.7 people per dwelling unit, we had 11,760 units. We're increasing the Costa Mesa population by 31,000. At what time do we, or where in the process do we look at how that impacts fire, police, streets, parking, or do we do it as we build? Is that what occurs? And again, this is a question. I'm not trying to make a point. I'm just asking the question.
Yeah, I think there's 2 times that we really address this. The first is with the housing element, and we do take a look at community services and infrastructure, but more at a programmatic level. The real detail and the analysis comes into play within the next 3 years after the housing element, when we're talking about implementing specific zoning policies or overlays or other programs and policies the council would like to see. And that's when the real analysis happens as to how we plan for infrastructure and also community services to go along with the population and housing units that we're talking about at a high level in the housing element.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much. Oh, sorry.
Councilmember Harper, I just wanted to add something real quick. Part of the methodology that went into all of this assumed that there was an existing need within a lot of communities already. So some of that may be that overcrowding that we talked about earlier, where part of these units are looking at or accommodating a need that exists within the community right now. So where there may be overcrowding because somebody can't, there's not affordable housing options available. There may be 6 people in a household that would then, 2 of them would go live in a separate apartment or something if it was available. So it may not be all new residents. It may also, obviously it's hard to tell what happens going forward, but it may be accommodating some of the city's existing need.
Oh, and there's some percentage of people that would just move into a bigger space or a different space.
Yeah, or just a different space if it was available at an income level that they could, or a level that they could afford.
And what percentage do you think that is?
If I had to guess, it would probably ties somewhat into the overcrowding number. So not a whole lot, as you mentioned. A lot of it would maybe be new residents, but I just wanted to make a note that a portion of it may be.
Maybe
Unfortunately,
that.
yeah, I couldn't tell you what
Okay.
the percentage would be.
Fair enough. Hey, thanks a lot. I appreciate it.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Councilmember Harper. Councilmember Reynolds.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks in advance for everyone's patience as I try to get through my notes here. I've got a few questions to knock out, and then just we'll share my perspectives on some of the data and strategies that we've seen today. So a few questions first. I don't know which slide it was, but you shared, Mr. Chen, a slide that showed kind of how far our current policies or overlays take us, and it was, I think, maybe two-thirds into the picture, and our remaining need was still something on the order of 7,000. My question there is when will we see how far some of these other strategies can take us? I still don't have a really good idea of like how big a bite ADUs might take us, or JADUs, or big Baker block type projects or other strategies. Is that something that we'll work through between now and maybe the next study session, or can we, just to get a sense of if we layer, how many of these different strategies do we need to layer on, and do any of us get us a far way, or do we really need all of them?
Yeah, absolutely. That is something we'll be working with over the next month, and working with staff and community members as well, to label out some of those strategies. I will say it's interesting because when we do this process, we don't want to come to a first study session like this and have all the processes already laid out and have it, because we're just not there yet. So it will be over the next month. I think what we'll bring to, or we plan to bring to the next City Council study session, the Joint Planning Commission City Council study session, is a much more refined look at those strategies and then options to the City Council to say, this is, if we implement this strategy in this way, this is the potential unit yield in terms of housing. There's again, as I mentioned in the presentation, there's a number of different options, and it just kind of depends on how we form the strategy. So it will be anticipated over the next month before.
Okay. I want to interpret the fact that you're not telling us that we really need to do them all as that we're going to have some choice versus like the only way to get to 11,000 is to do them all. Is that a fair interpretation, or am I jumping to conclusions there?
At this point, that's a fair interpretation. I just think it's still early it's too early still to be able to tell whether that's going to be needed or not.
Okay, great.
I would say, Councilmember Reynolds, one of the things that we're repeatedly hearing from the community is just this idea that we want to be strategic and we want to be thoughtful in how we plan for the locations of certain housing types. And ultimately, what our strategies speak to is sort of a bunch of options for strategies on how to move forward, so that we really can focus on what does the city leadership and the community ultimately feel is compatible with the fabric of Costa Mesa. What is our vision for Costa Mesa moving forward? So it is intended to be a number of strategies that ultimately we can sort of choose where we'd like to go. The numbers will dictate how many of those ultimately that we need to layer on, but certainly there's so many options in Costa Mesa that we don't expect that we'll be forced to do every single idea that's out there. It's certainly intended to be a very strategic discussion and strategic decision making.
Okay, yeah, I appreciate that. I think when we sort of first received or got hint at the scale at which the allocations would be, this sort of 11,000 ballpark, some of the reaction was like, no way can we do this unless we turn into New York City. And it's sounding like, no, that's not the case. We're going to have a lot of choice here and opportunities to be really strategic about how we place these or I guess create the capacity, right? That's good to know. I like choice. Okay. Other sort of big picture question is this idea. I think we heard a little bit in the public comments. We got through some of our in some of our emails. This idea of the kind of vision for the city or the image of the city. The idea that 40 units per acre could look very different depending on what the design standards are. But Mr. Chen, you said in your presentation that the housing element update process is really just about the location and the densities, right? We don't do some of that design work as part of this housing element update process. First question is, am I interpreting that right? And second question is, or maybe this is more of a comment I'll ask you to respond to. It does make me a little bit nervous about sort of committing to some of these higher densities without sort of tagging to those higher densities some of these design standards or some of this visioning. So how do we overlap those a little bit more? And I'll just add to that, since we had our shelter opening this morning, you know, a really important part of committing to that shelter was how we actually, you know, what the shelter looks like and how it operates. And I think it's a really important part of this housing discussion as well. So, you know, I'm nervous committing to higher densities without some of that visioning. And it sounds like those are discrete activities. Are there opportunities to sort of tag some rules on open space requirements or other design standards along with some of the density strategies?
Yeah, the city can certainly have those discussions as we go through this. What we were talking about earlier, what I referenced earlier, and you were correct in your interpretation of it, was that if we decide to alter an overlay zone or create a new one or any zoning, you know, method that we would decide to do, that would be a program in the housing element that the city would implement over the next 3 years. So they have 3 years to be able to do that. But it doesn't mean that we can't have conversations now about potentially what that would look like. Again, it doesn't necessarily draw into the housing element, but I think we've already had, just through the conversations that we've had with the community, the beginnings of some of those types of discussions about what housing should look like, and you know, what areas of the community, and even looking at some of the existing development in the community that people may not realize is as dense as it actually is. So the actual outlining development standards would be a later process, but I think we can certainly have some of those conversations now to try and figure out what it may look like. And obviously work with city staff to figure out what the process for developing those would be.
And just to add on a bit to that, when we first started out on the housing element update, and you know, this is a process that's mandated by state law to be completed by October, and certainly we don't want to rush a community conversation about visioning. So the idea with the housing element was to identify at very high levels, sort of high level programs and strategies that can include language. So for example, if we're talking about programs for a certain overlay area or a certain specific plan area, include wording in our programs that say, you know, develop these standards with respect to open space compatible design, and include that type of language in the housing element. So it really points us to as that next step to really developing design guidelines and development standards. But I don't think it would serve us to try to rush a visioning session or really cram any of that into a process that needs to be completed by October that has some penalties if we don't complete it by October. So I think that was our original approach to really laying this out, to lay out high-level policies with the housing element and then ultimately get into the details of design guidelines. But as Nick said, that doesn't stop us from beginning those conversations now and including some sort of directional language in the programs and policies that you know, really articulate the council's vision at this point. Obviously, the details to be prepared in the future.
And sorry, just to jump in for a second, I mean, I think that we also have the ability to be somewhat sequential in our recommendations as well, in terms of like our first priority is to execute X, follow once we establish what the vision and design standards are, then these are additional policies to follow, correct? Okay, go ahead. Sorry, interrupted you.
No, that's okay. Lots of other questions. I'll jump to another one. So we heard a couple comments about you know, what policies will and won't actually facilitate development, right? We still need the private sector to come in and build some of these homes. And I know that the housing element is about sort of creating the capacity or the policies that theoretically allow housing to get built, whether it actually happens still depends on the private sector. I know we have these stakeholder conversations. Is there any part of the process where, as part of delivering our draft housing element or finalizing the strategies, we do this sort of vetting process to say, okay, like, is this realistic? Are homes actually going to get built? Are these strategies like enough to actually encourage building?
Yeah, so I think we do part of that up front, and Jennifer, I'll let you, fill in anything that I missed, but part of that up front in some of the conversations that we're having right now, just as important as engaging the community and engaging housing advocacy groups is engaging the development community, both affordable and market rate, to see and make sure that what we're talking about has a realistic base and can be developed. So we've had some of those conversations. We will continue to have those conversations to make sure that, again, the whole point of the housing element is to identify strategies and sites that have a realistic assumption of capabilities of being developed. So as we talked about earlier with SB 35, there's, the city doesn't benefit from not building housing later on. And so it doesn't benefit from developing strategies that won't build housing.
I agree, and I would just add that we've started our one-on-one meetings with major landowners, so that's one of the steps that we take to just ensure that the feasibility analysis that we're doing, the sites analysis that we're doing is based in reality. A lot of those conversations with major landowners center around what are the landowners' future vision and future goals for the property, and how do those line up with the potential sites analysis, and ultimately how can the city and landowners who have common goals in terms of creating more housing units work together on something like that. So it's very important that in any general planning or comprehensive planning effort that we're reaching out to actual property owners and landowners and having those conversations. The city does not itself build housing, so certainly we could put policies and programs in place, but if those programs don't make sense to the property owners, we'll have programs that don't result in new housing units.
Yeah, good. Okay, thank you. And then I think last question, are we coordinating at all with Newport Beach and Santa Ana for some of the areas or neighborhoods that sort of abut their borders or borders with them? I know, for example, Newport Beach is looking at the John Wayne area and also sort of our what we call Mesa West area, that part, the 15th Street and Superior, that area. They're looking at that for some of their building. And if we want to have sort of a more cohesive vision, it does seem like coordination would make sense. I'm curious if any of that's happening now.
We haven't currently coordinated with any cities, but it is a great comment to take a look at what those cities are doing and try and see if there's any ability to sync up efforts in terms of what areas may look like.
And I'd say we've had conversations at the staff level and with staff in adjacent cities just as to their housing element efforts. We always try to keep track of what adjacent cities are doing in terms of comprehensive planning programs, but also community outreach and other things like that. And without embarrassing Mr. Chen too much, I will say I think we have an inside track with Newport Beach in particular because Kimley Horn is also their consultant for the housing element. So.
Oh, great. Okay.
There's some built-in coordination there.
There is.
Okay. I'll admit, while taking a walk yesterday, I tuned into their update, and I just wanted to share a little bit of information on another comment we received about sort of who affordable housing is for. And they had a great slide with some examples of sort of qualifying salaries. Affordable housing, it's so expensive here in California. So affordable housing is for Newport Mesa teachers, Hoag Hospital nurses, paralegals, police officers, and librarians were some examples of people who have salaries that would qualify within those lower income categories. Okay, I'll share, thank you for answering those questions. I'll try to run through fairly quickly some of the big picture perspectives I have. First, I just want to share, we had some conversation already about the consequences if we don't meet our housing need. And those are certainly serious. Don't want to lose any of the funding that we get, that we need to maintain some of our infrastructure. But I just want to express that I think we need housing, period. I don't want us to operate in sort of a place of fear and consequences. We need housing. We opened our homeless shelter. We know that there are people living on our streets. We know that there's quite a significant population of, what do we call it, the invisible homeless, people who are sharing homes with other people. We've gotten some communication in the past few weeks as council from the folks at Project Hope Alliance in the school district who are tracking the increasing homelessness among our children. So we need housing, and I hope that we approach this not out of a place of fear, but out of a place of really trying to creatively solve a need in a way that also enhances our community. And I think we have a really fantastic planning commission and council who take that perspective as well. But just wanted to express that. I think we also need housing for income. I've attended a few presentations recently about, where city revenue comes from, and we rely quite a bit, I think about 45% on sales tax. And that's something that, is becoming more and more challenging, not just in difficult economic times, but as e-commerce continues to flourish, we're getting a smaller percent of that sales tax. So I think we need housing to bring the revenue that we need to provide the city services that our residents want and expect. And we talk about being a diverse and eclectic city. I want to welcome new families to Costa Mesa. I want young professionals with great jobs coming to Costa Mesa. I want to support our businesses who want to attract those families to Costa Mesa. I want, in my neighborhood, there are quite a few multi-generational families, which is such a fun part of the city that really keeps sort of the history of Costa Mesa in the city and keeps people really rooted. I want the children of current residents to be able to live in Costa Mesa. So I support housing, period, and I want us to be both creative in the policies that we offer and offer realistic policies that actually result in housing. So I just wanted to start with that. I do think the visioning is really important, and I'm encouraged that I think almost every council member has mentioned visioning and really wants to support that. Certainly, we don't want to rush through it, but we don't want to be 5 years from now still talking about visioning. So I hope that that's something that we launch into fairly quickly. Probably because I've lived outside of Orange County for college, I do have a really positive association with density. I know it can absolutely be done wrong. I think we've seen that in Costa Mesa in the last decade, but I know that it can absolutely be done right. I think of Brooklyn Brownstones or Comm Ave and Newbury Street in Boston is like really, really beautiful neighborhoods. While tuning into Newport Beach's housing element meeting last night, I was taking a walk through my neighborhood, through the Sunshine District to Fairview Park, and then down the riverbed, and realized that Olive Canyon and Pacific over on the west side are actually pretty dense neighborhoods, but they're beautiful, quiet streets, lively streets, safe streets. So density can be done right, and I think we should be creative about that. We've heard I'll throw a few, taglines out there. We've heard the terms complete neighborhoods, 15-minute city. I recently learned of the 330-300, which are, I think, sort of visioning ideas that I would love to explore as part of these visioning processes. And that's really this idea of clustering density around amenities, one, to create neighborhoods that people want to live in, and two, to really mitigate the impact of additional traffic. I don't think traffic and housing necessarily have to come together. I know that's not the case because I've lived it. I think Costa Mesa is well positioned to be a city that offers housing options where people don't need to have a car or don't need to use their car every day. Other things that I've heard, and I really support the idea of diverse housing options. I think that's fantastic. We're a diverse, eclectic city. We should provide diverse housing to support that. To really support higher density at Fairview Developmental Center, I think that's an easy opportunity to bump up our numbers and create some creative housing there. A couple of things I want to be careful about are too much reliance on city-owned properties. Open space, we've heard discussed here. We know we already have a lack of open space as we increase housing. I think it's really important to make sure that we do have open space, and I think city-owned property is maybe one of our best opportunities at open space. So I don't know how much opportunity there is there, but I don't want to default and lose opportunities to use publicly owned property for more public amenities. I'm also concerned about maintaining a good mix of commercial and industrial zones, especially over on the west side. We've got a lot of really creative businesses that do support our creative economy here in Costa Mesa. And while I think it'd be great to have a mix of housing in those areas, I don't want to displace some of our longstanding businesses that do provide local jobs. And the last thing I'm really concerned about, and I as much as I read about it, I'm learning that there aren't tried and true solutions, and that's the challenge of displacement. And I think Councilmember Chavez got to this a little bit. How do we encourage housing while minimizing displacing current residents? And I appreciated one of the recommendations that staff provided in the staff report about a focus on reusing commercial and industrial sites rather than redevelopment. I'd be curious in learning more strategies to protect against displacement of current families while maintaining a good mix of commercial and industrial in our cities. Last thing, promise.
Last thing,
and that was last thing on this. It was a comment we received during public comment supporting urban infill. I do think that there's certainly in the conversations I've heard with members of the public, there's a lot of concern about sort of additional housing and density creeping into their neighborhoods. I hope that our education over the next month can share with us ways that sort of gentle density in existing neighborhoods can happen in a positive way. And again, I think of the brownstones and the Newberry Streets, Canyon Drive and Pacific Drive over on the west side. Parts of the Sunshine Track are actually R2, looks like R1, but are R2 neighborhoods. I don't think that we should default to not touching existing residential neighborhoods. I think there's ways we can do that in a really positive way. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Reynolds. I'm just teasing you. Councilmember Harlan.
Thank you, Madam Mayor Pro Tem. Well, thankfully, Councilmember Reynolds covered a lot of the ground that I wanted to touch on, so I will keep my comments fairly brief. I'd like to start with a few questions of staff, though. So the first one, and maybe this is for Mr. Chen. I appreciated the information that was part of the community profile, that little snapshot that we saw. When can we expect a draft of that for the council to review? And then the second part of it is, I'm especially interested in making sure that we've got economic data to consider, and in particular related to employment. I think employment is a huge driver of housing for us here. So I'd like to make sure we identify, types of employment as well as wages and salaries, just so we get a little bit more accurate assessment of, who's in our community and what jobs that we have here. So go back to the first question. When can we expect the community profile?
So I think the current schedule, and we're still working this through with city staff, is to have that as part of the public review draft that comes out with the document. If there's a desire for the council to see it earlier, I think we can talk with staff if that's a possibility. I will say that it does include economic data. It does include information on professions, on basically the split within the city and the major professions within the city, and how residents essentially fall into those different categories. I'd have to go back and look. I'm not 100% sure that it addresses salaries. So I took a note on that to see if that information is in there or not currently.
Okay, thank you. And then another question of staff, and this is more for, I really kind of want to harp on this point related to Measure Y. So Measure Y basically says any major land use change requires a vote of the people, and I'm paraphrasing very liberally there. So for staff, that would include our general plan, any amendment to the general plan, like the land use element, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And same thing applies to Newport Boulevard specific plan.
Yes.
And so Becca plan.
Yes.
And any of the overlays on the west side.
Yes.
Okay. So for all intents and purposes, we're putting together a programmatic policy plan with the housing element. Everything that might follow would be subject to Measure Y. So all of our implementation really would require, could potentially be triggered by Measure Y.
Probably most of it.
Probably most. And anything, Ms. Barlow, you think that would not be?
Until I see more specifics, I don't know.
Okay. No, fair enough. I mean, the point I'm just trying to make is that to the extent that we go through a housing element and hopefully get one that's compliant, we still have a lot of work ahead of us after that point. And so Measure Y doesn't just impact us in this process, but everything subsequent. So I kind of want to go back to maybe kind of a bigger picture idea. And I've mentioned this, I think, before, which is that I really feel strongly that the housing element needs to have some guiding principles or some structure against which we evaluate or consider specific strategies. And if not guiding principles, maybe it's something like objectives. And I'll just list 4 just as an example. So something as simple as facilitate home building, or end homelessness, or fund affordable housing. I mean, all of these, I think, are little buckets that we need to hopefully come to some consensus on, so that this is organized in a way that makes sense when we come up with specific strategies. And I don't know that we've done that effort just yet. And lastly, on this notion of visioning, it's never too early to be doing visioning. When we talk about housing, to my mind, and I'm going to crib a little from some of the Planning Commission comments, this really is about neighborhood building or community building. And to the planner, I think of it in terms of corridors, districts, and neighborhoods. These are your basic building blocks of a city. And that's ultimately what the goal is to have well-designed neighborhoods, corridors, and districts, not particularly dense areas. When I hear comments about density, usually it's not so much an objection about density. I mean, that's just a ratio. It's really about form and design. And so people respond to that. And I think we need to be very careful about how we do plan and design our neighborhoods. So I want to encourage people to give as much input as possible about that. What does it mean? Is it massing? Is it scale? Is it architecture? Because, the housing element is not a mathematical exercise. It can't be. We're not just trying to cram as many units as possible. For us to be successful is really to have well-designed community. And I know that means different things for different people, but housing is the vehicle in which we're going to do that. So those are the only comments I have tonight. I'm looking forward to having another joint session with Planning Commission, and hopefully we can work towards, like I suggested, coming up with some guiding principles or even specific objectives to move this forward.
I just got a note from Councilmember Marr that she might have gotten booted off. I think she'll be calling back in. Does anyone else have their hands up?
No, there are no other hands up. Councilmember Reynolds, I'm not sure who the host is, but I don't see any other hands.
All I'm hearing is that I think we need a mayor pro tem.
I'll so since she's not here to to tell me no, I'll ask one question I forgot to ask. And that was just if from staff, if we can get the list of the different stakeholders who participated in those focus group meetings, that would be helpful too. So we know who we might have missed.
Yeah, and following Councilmember Reynolds' point, I forgot a point earlier in my discussion, so I'll just mention it quickly. I think also in lieu of preventing gentrification in more of our traditional neighborhoods, it's also intelligent to build maybe higher density out around the freeways, so north of the 405 and like north of 73, just because we want to have places for people to move into if they want to move to Costa Mesa. That's not going to remove people from our communities. So that's my last point.
Got her back.
I think it's all yours, Mayor Pro Tem. Mayor Pro Tem, can you hear us?
I'm back. Sorry
Okay.
about that.
There you go. It's all yours now.
Oh, good. All right. If you get through everybody else. Oh, the joys of doing this remotely. Okay, I'll zoom through my comments really quickly. I don't think I'm out of questions that they've been asked at this point. So, comments. Excited to see the inclusionary housing ordinance come back to us. We've been talking about that for a long time. I know the devil is the details, and so I'm glad we've got folks assisting us with that specific experience. I do also think we've been talking about Measure Y and the definition of affordable housing for 2 years at this point, at least while I've been on council. We need to figure out how to get that resolved. And so I'm not sure if that is at a council meeting or if that is a vote of the people or how that works. The city attorney, could we get something formal back from your opinion that we can share with the public to figure out what the course of action is? Because I think we kind of batted around. We know it's an issue, but we need to get it resolved. To Mr. Clem's point about the fair housing 8686, I'd like to understand that a little bit better too. So I don't expect anyone to provide a dissertation at that point, nor do we want to be here for that. But I'd like to understand it and make sure we're addressing it adequately in the housing element. I was excited to see corridor plans mentioned during the meetings that were held with the community and coming up in a variety of different ways. I worry tremendously about blight on Harbor and Newport Boulevard as a result of aging retail and retail of last resort when we start seeing nothing but shady looking massage parlors and illegal dispensaries. It's a sign that there needs to be some change and that we are not doing enough to encourage the kind of development that we'd like to see. The other thing is, back to this question of visuals and visioning. I think corridor plans and corridor specific plans as an outcome of the housing element would be something where we really can speak specifically about what this looks like. I was caught at the very beginning of the presentation that the pie chart showed apartments and then mixed use, but like those are not mutually exclusive, right? We could have apartments above retail and that is mixed use. And so if ever there was a place to really show people what the potential could be, the connecting bike path all the way down Harbor, the setbacks, the retail that has been successful in the city over the last 10 years, potentially apartments on top. Everyone sort of says, I don't want to be like this city, right? I don't want to look like that city. I would love to look like Bird Rock in La Jolla, right? That is, to me, just a beautiful example of how mixed use is done well, because it is walkable and then it's got retail on the bottom, apartments up top. Like there are examples that are just really fabulous, and I think being able to share that visual with the public would go a really long way. We didn't specifically talk to permanent supportive housing, but in our menu of housing options, and to the extent that Councilmember Reynolds was talking about, we need to support all kinds of housing. That in particular stands out to me as a need. There's some misconception about affordability percentages. So there are lots of developments. If you think about some of the things that Jamboree Housing does, for example, those will be 100% affordable. And then there's places like in Irvine where there's an inclusionary housing ordinance and it's 90% market rate and 10% affordable or 15% affordable. And then within that affordability, there's definitions of low, very low, et cetera. And so I think I've seen some of the comments saying, well, now every development needs to be 40% affordable. And that's just not the case. It's that the average needs to be 40% to get to our RHNA number. But it might look like completely different things from development to development. And we do also need to have policies to encourage those 100% affordable projects as well. Especially when they're, when they're mixed into a community and you have no idea which building is which. There's a really good opportunity to get big chunks of that number taken care of. So just something for the public to be aware of. I want to echo the concern about displacing people. I think that came to our attention specifically with the Mesa West residential ownership urban plan. A lot of those urban plans were from 2006. Some of them are more recent, but a lot of them are pretty old at this point. And so Mr. Chen, you had said something to the effect of, using those and counting the numbers and then seeing where we need to go. I would argue that almost all of those need to be revised to some extent or updated because, again, I think specifically on the west side, in some cases, those have actually been used as a tool of displacement. And then the last thing I wanted to say is that, we are going to get some funds from the federal government as part of the last round of congressional funding. To me, that using it for some of this visioning that we've been talking about, that we've been kicking the can down the road, as Ms. McDonald said, using it for some real visioning planning that's going to include visuals, that's going to include community engagement, that isn't going to be cheap, is a good use of our funds to pave the way for the future. This is where we get to say, what all of this should look like so that we're not talking about one-off development projects. We're talking about what we want as a city. So that is it. And I'm going to try to do this from my phone now, which may not be ideal, and I apologize for that. So were there any other council members that wanted to say anything else? Speak now if we're ever hold your speech, because I don't know that I can see your hand raised.
In case you can't see, just there's no hands raised.
No hands raised.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
I appreciate that. All right. Can I get a motion to receive and file from a member of council?
Make a motion to receive and file.
Thank you, sir. Second?
I'll second.
Okay. Councilmember Reynolds seconds. And Ms. Green, we can call for the vote.
Actually, Mayor Pro Tem, the direction is just provided. We do not vote at the study session.
That's right. Thank you for reminding me. I'll just combine it as this whole phone thing now. So, all right. Well, excellent. Any other comments from council? All right. Well, everyone have a great night. Thank you so much to all the members of the public who came out. I know we didn't have that many speakers, but we did have a lot of people watching and tracking this process closely. So thank you all for participating. Continue to send us email. And Councilmember Harper's already gone. All right. Good night, everyone. Take care.